They called it the American Dream made real. 300,000 men crossed oceans and mountains for it. They dug, and they suffered, and they built something extraordinary. And when it was over, most of them had nothing. The gold was gone. The land was gone. In many cases, so were they. What remained, the cities, the railroads, the state itself, belonged to men who never once lifted a pan. Coloma, California. January the 24th, 1848. A carpenter named James Marshall is checking a water channel at first light when something catches his eye in the stream bed below. He reaches down. The piece of metal is smaller than a thumbnail. He bites it. It does not shatter. He does not yet know what he has found. But what follows will move more people, overturn more laws, and bury more history than almost any event in the American century. In the winter of 1847, California was barely a place on most Americans' maps. It had just been seized from Mexico at the end of a 2-year war. Its non-indigenous population numbered around 14,000 people scattered across a vast, largely unmapped territory. The nearest American city of consequence was thousands of miles away. Nobody was watching California. Nobody had reason to. John Sutter was one of the few men who had built something there. A Swiss immigrant with grand ambitions and considerable debts, he had carved out a sprawling agricultural estate in the Sacramento Valley, which he called New Helvetia. By 1847, he needed lumber to expand it, and lumber meant a sawmill. He found his man in a carpenter from New Jersey named James Wilson Marshall, who had drifted west after the Mexican-American War looking for work. Sutter and Marshall struck a partnership. Sutter would provide capital. Marshall would oversee construction. They chose a site in the valley the local Nisenan people called Coloma, roughly 45 miles east of Sutter's Fort, where the South Fork of the American River ran fast and cold through stands of ponderosa pine. Marshall set his crew to work in the autumn of 1847. Among them were local Nisenan workers and a group of Mormon veterans who had fought in California and stayed. It was a quiet, unremarkable operation in a quiet, unremarkable valley. Marshall had been digging out the tail race, the channel that carries water away from the mill wheel, when he noticed the flow was not running cleanly. On the morning of January the 24th, 1848, he walked down to inspect it. The water had been shut off overnight to let the channel settle. As Marshall stepped into the stream bed, he saw something catch the light beneath the surface. He reached in and picked it up. It was a thin, flat scale of metal, smaller than a fingernail. He turned it over in his hand. It had the color of old brass, but a different weight to it. He bit it, the oldest test a man could apply. It did not crack or crumble. He found a flat rock and struck it. It flattened without breaking. He collected 4 or 5 more pieces from the stream bed and walked back up to the mill. He showed them to the crew. One man suggested it was fool's gold, iron pyrite, which shatters when struck. Marshall knew what he had was something else entirely. He was a carpenter, not a geologist. But he had seen enough. He rode to Sutter's Fort 4 days later and showed the samples to Sutter in private. The two men consulted an encyclopedia. They ran their own tests, including immersing the metal in a strong lye solution. Nothing degraded it. Sutter's diary records that when the results came back, he sat quietly for a long moment. Then he told Marshall it was pure gold. The two men looked at each other across the table and understood, in different ways, what they were holding. Sutter's first instinct was not celebration. It was dread. He had spent years building his agricultural empire, and he understood immediately that a gold discovery of any scale would bring men flooding into his land, trampling his crops, slaughtering his cattle, and obliterating everything he had built. The following day, he rode up to the mill himself and asked every worker present to swear an oath of secrecy. They agreed. The secret lasted 11 days. Word moved first through the workers and then through the valley. A Mormon employee named Henry Bigler recorded the discovery in his diary on January the 24th, the only contemporaneous written record of the exact date. By February, men were quietly prospecting along the South Fork. By March, the word had reached San Francisco, but most people dismissed it. Gold in California sounded like the kind of story men told to sell land. It needed a promoter, and it found one in Samuel Brannan. Brannan was a Mormon businessman who owned San Francisco's only newspaper, a store near Sutter's Fort, and an instinct for opportunity that bordered on genius. In the week before his announcement, he quietly purchased every pickaxe, shovel, and tin pan available in San Francisco. Then, on the 12th of May, 1848, he walked into Portsmouth Square, held up a glass vial of gold dust, and shouted his way into history. Within days, 2/3 of San Francisco's male population had left for the goldfields. Brannan never dug an ounce of gold in his life. In a matter of months, he was California's first millionaire. In the months after Samuel Brannan's announcement, the news moved in every direction at once. It traveled by ship to Hawaii, to Chile, to Australia, to the ports of southern China. It moved by newspaper from New York to London to Paris. It moved by word of mouth through the mining districts of Sonora, Mexico, and through the dockside taverns of Sydney. Each place it landed differently. But the effect was the same. Men began making plans they had no real basis for making. President Polk's address to Congress on December 5, 1848, turned a rumor into a national directive. For the men and families of the American East who had dismissed earlier reports as fantasy, the president's confirmation changed everything. Polk told Congress that the accounts of gold were of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by officers of the public service. That sentence was a starting pistol. By January of 1849, the ports of Boston and New York were overwhelmed with men booking passage west. There were 3 ways to reach California from the American East, and none of them were kind. The Overland Trail ran roughly 3,000 miles across plains, desert, and mountain range. Travelers set out in wagon trains from Missouri in spring, timing their departure to cross the Sierra Nevada before the first snows. The journey took between 3 and 7 months. The trail was marked by its second and third years, not by signposts but by the wreckage of wagons, the graves of oxen, and the belongings that families had abandoned to lighten their loads as the mountains rose ahead of them. The Cape Horn route went by sea, south around the tip of South America and north again to San Francisco. The voyage covered 18,000 nautical miles and took approximately 6 months. Ships designed for cargo were hastily refitted for passengers, which meant men sleeping in stacked bunks in holds with no ventilation, rationed water, and food that deteriorated well before landfall. Disease moved through the crowded lower decks efficiently. Scurvy, dysentery, and fevers took men who had left home healthy and arrived, if they arrived, diminished. The Panama shortcut was faster, but offered its own particular dangers. Travelers sailed to the Atlantic coast of Panama, canoed up the Chagres River for 75 miles through dense jungle, then rode mules 25 miles across the isthmus to Panama City, where they waited, sometimes for weeks, for a northbound ship. The jumble crossing was a gauntlet of cholera, yellow fever, and malaria. Men who survived the isthmus sometimes died waiting on the Pacific side. The route cost between $600 and $1,200, a sum that represented years of wages for most working men. The Americans who came were a cross-section of a society in motion. Farmers from Ohio and Illinois who had never left their counties. Lawyers and merchants from Boston and Philadelphia who calculated that a season in the gold fields would make them wealthy. Former soldiers still adrift after the Mexican-American War. Free black men from the northern states who understood, correctly, that California's distance from the established slave states offered a form of freedom unavailable at home. Enslaved men brought west by their owners, some of whom would use the chaos of the goldfields to purchase or claim their liberty. From Mexico came men who already knew how to mine. The experienced placer miners of Sonora were among the first to reach the Sierra Nevada foothills, arriving before most Americans had even confirmed the news. They brought with them techniques, The batia, a shallow wooden bowl for separating gold from gravel that the inexperienced 49ers would spend months trying to replicate. Chilean miners arrived by the thousands, some with their own capital and equipment. From Peru came men carrying knowledge of Andean silver mining that translated directly to the California diggings. From China came men who called California Gamsan, Gold Mountain. Most were from the Guangdong province in the south, where a combination of crop failures, the aftermath of the First Opium War, and punishing taxation had made survival a daily negotiation. They were almost exclusively men, leaving wives and children behind with the intention of earning enough to return home transformed. The voyage across the Pacific took between 1 and 3 months in conditions of severe overcrowding. Many arrived already in debt, their passage having been funded by associations that would take a portion of everything they earned. From Australia came men galvanized by the same newspaper headlines that had reached everywhere else. The sea route from Sydney to San Francisco was relatively direct, and Australian ships were among the first foreign vessels to arrive in numbers. From France came thousands of men shaken loose by the political upheavals of 1848, for whom California represented not just gold but escape from a continent that had just watched its revolutions fail. From Ireland came men who had survived the famine years and had nothing left to lose. Each group carried a different history into the same gold fields. Women were a minority so small they were a kind of currency. The census of 1850 recorded that only 8% of California's population was female. In the mining counties, the proportion was far lower. Some women had come with husbands and families, making the overland journey in wagons. Some had come independently, recognizing that in a world of men with money and nowhere to spend it, the services a woman could provide, cooking, laundry, boarding, could yield extraordinary returns. A woman running a boarding house in a mining camp in 1849 could earn more in a month than a miner earned in a year. The camps that received all these people were not towns. They were eruptions, collections of tents and hastily nailed timber frames that appear in a valley one week and doubled in size the next. They had names: Drunkard's Bar, Angel's Camp, Gaujai Whiskey Town, that told you everything about the men who named them and the expectations they had arrived with. Sanitation was non-existent. Clean water was the first casualty of any new camp. Disease followed within weeks, moving through populations packed together in conditions no physician would have endorsed. What is striking in retrospect is the sheer duration of the journey most of these men had made before they lifted their first pan. The Chilean who had sailed for 6 weeks. The Chinese man who had crossed the Pacific in a crowded hold and arrived in debt. The Irishman who had walked to a port, begged passage, survived a sea voyage, and then trekked inland. By the time most of them saw the Sierra Nevada foothills for the first time, they had already spent everything they had on the journey to get there. The dream of Gold Mountain was already behind schedule before the work began. The diversity of the early camps was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of any society in 1849. Photographs from the period show Chinese and white miners working side by side at the same sluice boxes. Antonio Franco Coronel, a Californio from Los Angeles, recorded in his memoir that in the summer of 1848, men of a dozen nationalities worked adjacent claims without visible friction. The gold in those first months was close to the surface and plentiful enough that competition had not yet hardened into hostility. That tolerance had a precise expiry date. It lasted exactly as long as the easy gold lasted. When surface deposits began to thin, faster than anyone had expected, and certainly faster than the newspapers had implied, the mathematics changed. A fixed and diminishing quantity of gold divided among a rapidly growing number of claimants produced a predictable result. Men who had been neighbors became rivals, and rivals needed a reason why the other man's claim was more legitimate than their own. That reason, in California in the early 1850s, was almost always race. The world that had come to California was, for one brief window, the most diverse community on the North American continent. It was also a community with no rules, no established authority, and no shared framework for resolving the conflicts that scarcity was about to produce. What filled that vacuum? The laws, the taxes, the violence, the expulsions would define California for generations. But in those first years, before the machinery of exclusion was assembled, something genuinely unprecedented existed in the Sierra Nevada foothills. A place where a man from Guangdong and a man from Galway and a man from Santiago worked the same river and went back to adjacent camps at the end of the same day. Most of them would not stay. Most would leave with less than they had brought. A significant number would leave in conditions they had not chosen, driven out by laws that did not yet exist when they arrived. But they came. 300,000 of them, from 6 continents, speaking dozens of languages, carrying different gods and different techniques and different ideas about what the word fortune meant. The world had heard California calling and had answered. What California did with that answer is the rest of this story. The newspapers had not prepared them for the cold. The Sierra Nevada foothills in early spring are unforgiving country. Mornings that begin below freezing, afternoons that shift without warning, river water so cold that a man's hands go numb within minutes of entering it. Most of the 49ers who arrive in 1849 had spent the previous months reading accounts of men scooping gold from sun-warmed streams. The reality was a man crouching for hours at the edge of snowmelt runoff, working ground that had already been worked by the men who arrived before him. The basic tool of early placer mining was the pan, a shallow, wide-rimmed iron or tin dish, not unlike a skillet. The technique was simple in principle and exhausting in practice. A miner scooped gravel and sand from a stream bed into the pan, submerged it, then swirled the water in a slow, continuous rotation. Gold, being heavier than gravel, settled toward the center, while the lighter material washed over the rim. A skilled miner working a productive claim might pan 60 to 80 loads of gravel in a working day. Most of the time, what settled at the bottom was nothing. The rocker box, sometimes called a cradle, was the next step up, a wooden box mounted on curved runners that allowed it to be rocked back and forth while water was poured through it. One man shoveled gravel into the top, another poured water, a third rocked the box. The riffles, small wooden crossbars fixed to the bottom of the box, caught heavier particles as the lighter material washed through. It was faster than panning alone, but it required 3 men to operate, which meant 3 men splitting whatever came out of it. The arithmetic of partnership was already beginning to work against the individual miner. The sluice box extended the principle further, a long wooden trough, sometimes running 50 feet or more, through which a continuous stream of water was directed. Gravel was shoveled in at the top, water carried the lighter material away, and gold settled against the riffles. By the early 1850s, sluices had become the dominant technology in the more organized camps. They required significant labor to build and maintain, which meant that men with capital, or groups of men willing to pool it, could process far more gravel than an individual with a pan. The individual miner with a pan was already becoming obsolete within 2 years of the rush beginning. The average daily yield per miner fell sharply after 1848. The first men on the richest claims in 1848 and early 1849 sometimes pulled out extraordinary quantities of gold in a single day. By the time the mass of 49ers arrived in late 1849, those claims were largely exhausted. Most men working the remaining ground were pulling out a few dollars worth of gold per day, and a few dollars per day that the mining camps of California did not come close to covering expenses. The cost of living in the camps was a form of additional taxation that nobody had mentioned in the newspaper accounts. A dozen eggs cost $1 at a time when a skilled laborer in the East earned less than $1 a day. A blanket could cost $30. A shovel that sold for 75 cents in New York sold for $10 at the mines. Flour, bacon, beans, the staples of camp existence, were priced at multiples of their Eastern cost, and the prices rose as demand increased and supply routes remained unreliable. Men who had spent everything to get to California found themselves spending what little they earned simply to remain alive and operational. The diet of a mining camp was a slow form of physiological decline. Beans and bacon and bread day after day, with fresh vegetables and fruit essentially unavailable. Scurvy appeared in camps within months of their establishment, recognizable in the bleeding of gums and the loosening of teeth. Dysentery and cholera moved through populations sharing water sources that were simultaneously being used as latrines and mining operations upstream. The rainy season brought mud that turned camp paths to channels. The dry season brought dust and heat. There was no period of the year in the gold fields that could honestly be described as comfortable. The letters men wrote home during these years document, in careful detail, the distance between expectation and experience. One miner wrote to his wife from the American River in 1849 that he had arrived full of high hopes, only to find that the ground gave up its gold grudgingly, and the men around him were no different from the men back home, some lucky, most not, all working harder than they had ever worked for results that made no argument for having come. The letters that followed tended to grow shorter. The men who had nothing to report eventually stopped reporting. By the early 1850s, the easy surface gold, what miners called placer gold, loose deposits lying in riverbeds and streambeds where water had carried it down from higher ground, was largely stripped. What remained was embedded in quartz rock deep underground, and extracting it required not a pan and strong arms but tunnels, machinery, capital, and engineering. Hard rock mining was a different industry from placer mining. It required investment on a scale that an individual could not provide. One by one, the independent miners who would define the image of the gold rush were replaced by wage laborers working for mining companies owned by men they would never meet. The men who had come for independence found themselves, at the end of it, employees. The prospector who had mortgaged his farm in Ohio, crossed the plains in a wagon, and spent 3 years panning a California river was by the mid-1850s typically working for wages in a hard rock mine, sending home letters that did not describe riches. Sullivan Osborne, one of the 49ers whose diary survived, wrote in 1857 that he had arrived in California full of bright anticipation only to find those dreams had long since perished and that he had lived and fared, in his own words, like a dog. He was not unusual. He was the rule. There is a phrase that circulated among the more clear-eyed observers of the California gold rush, almost from the beginning. Mining the miners. It described a simple insight that a small number of people grasped early and acted on decisively, that in a world where hundreds of thousands of men were chasing gold, the reliable money was not in chasing gold. It was in selling things to the men who were. The gold was uncertain. The miners' need for shovels, flour, boots, blankets, and somewhere to sleep was not. Samuel Brannan had understood this before he made his announcement. The week he spent buying up every pickaxe, pan, and shovel in San Francisco before running through Portsmouth Square with his vial of gold dust was not impulsive. It was calculation. By the time the men he had just electrified arrived at his store to equip themselves for the gold fields, he was the only seller. His store near Sutter's Fort was reporting sales of $150,000 a month by 1849, a figure that represented more gold than most miners would see in a lifetime of work. Brannan had not found gold. He had found something more reliable, a captive market. The supply monopoly Brannan had engineered in those first weeks was the purest expression of what the gold rush actually rewarded. Not labor, not luck, positioning. The men who arrived first and understood the shape of what was coming, who recognized that a migration of 300,000 people would need to eat, sleep, travel, dress, bank, and be entertained, built fortunes that the gold itself could not have provided. The miners were the engine. The merchants were the ones who collected the fuel. Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco in 1853 from Bavaria, carrying dry goods intended for the mining trade. He had not come to mine. He came because a brother-in-law in New York had told him there was business to be done outfitting miners, and Strauss had listened. What he found was a population of men destroying their clothing faster than anyone could replace it, canvas trousers that wore through at the knees within weeks, pockets that tore under the weight of tools and samples. He began making trousers from heavy canvas duck cloth, later denim, reinforcing the stress points with copper rivets. The company those trousers built still carries his name. Leland Stanford arrived in California in 1852 and opened a supply store in Sacramento. He was not a miner. He was a lawyer who had failed in the East and recognized that the West, at that particular moment, rewarded men who sold things to miners rather than men who competed with them. The profits from his Sacramento store gave him the capital to invest in railroad ventures a decade later. Stanford became one of the four men who built the Central Pacific Railroad and one of the wealthiest men in American history. He later founded a university with the fortune those Sacramento sales helped seed. His name is on a campus, not a mining claim. Henry Wells and William Fargo had watched the gold rush from New York and seen a different gap. 300,000 people were moving gold from the Sierra Nevada foothills to San Francisco, and from San Francisco to banks in the east, on foot, on mule, in saddlebags, in ways that were slow, unreliable, and vulnerable. In 1852, they founded Wells, Fargo, and Company to provide express mail and banking services along the California routes. Within 3 years, their offices lined the main streets of every significant mining town. They survived the financial panic of 1855 when most California banks failed. Today, they are one of the largest financial institutions on Earth. Philip Armour came to California in 1852 to sell provisions to miners from a small trench he dug near a mining camp. We sold muddy water to men who needed it to work their sluices. The business was undignified and profitable. He took those profits back east when the rush wound down and used them as seed capital for a meatpacking operation in Chicago. The Armour Meatpacking Company eventually became one of the largest food businesses in American history. It was built, in a direct line of capital, on the miners' need for a bucket of water in 1852 California. San Francisco was the clearest expression of what merchant capital could build. In 1848, the settlement at Yerba Buena, not yet renamed, had fewer than 1,000 residents. By 1850, it had 25,000. By 1855, the city had a functioning stock exchange, several major banks, a daily newspaper industry, theaters, hotels, and a port that had become the third busiest in the nation after New York and Boston. It had been built almost entirely on the money of men who never found gold, selling goods and services to men who mostly did not find it either. The irony at the center of this story sat mostly unexamined during the years of the rush itself. John Sutter, on whose land the gold had been discovered, lost nearly everything. Marshall, who found it, spent the rest of his life trying unsuccessfully to stake his own claims and died in poverty. The men who arrived late, with less capital and less positioning, worked the ground until it gave nothing back and then went home diminished. Meanwhile, the men who had recognized, from the beginning or soon after, that the gold rush was not primarily about gold, it was about the surge in demand for everything around gold, built the institutions that outlasted the rush by generations. This is what the mythology erased. The image of the 49er, the independent man with his pan and his mule and his unshakable belief in his own luck, was a true image of the experience of most men who came. It was not a true image of where the wealth went. The wealth went to the men who sold the pan, fed the mule, and charged the 49er rent on the ground he slept on. It always had. The gold rush did not invent this dynamic, but it demonstrated it at scale for the first time in American history, and then the mythology was written in a way that made sure nobody noticed. California became a state in September of 1850, 2 years after the gold discovery, less than 2 years after Samuel Brannan had walked through Portsmouth Square. It was the fastest path to statehood in American history. The population surge the gold rush had produced gave California the numbers it needed, and Congress, eager to settle the question of whether this enormously wealthy new territory would be slave or free, admitted it as a free state under the Compromise of 1850. California had barely formed a government when that government began writing laws to decide who belonged there. The first foreign miners' tax was passed by the California legislature in 1850. Its official title was an Act for the Better Regulation of the Mines and the Government of Foreign Miners. Its practical function was simpler. It imposed a fee of $20 per month on any miner who was not a United States citizen. $20 in 1850 was the equivalent of roughly $500 today. For a miner earning a few dollars a day on a marginal claim, it was not a tax. It was an eviction notice written in legal language. The tax's first and most immediate victims were the Mexican and Chilean miners who had been among the first to arrive in California and among the most skilled at the work. Many had been in the gold fields before most Americans had even confirmed the news. They had knowledge, technique, and established claims. The foreign miners' tax stripped the economic logic from staying. Within months of the law's passage, tens of thousands of Latin American miners abandoned their claims and left. Some returned to Mexico and Chile. Some moved to California's cities and found other work. The gold fields they had worked were taken over by the men whose legislature had just legislated them out. The law was repealed in 1851, not out of fairness, but out of commercial pragmatism. Merchants and landowners in the mining counties had watched their customer base evaporate and their rents collapse as tens of thousands of miners departed. They lobbied hard for repeal. The legislature complied. What this sequence revealed was not that California had reconsidered its exclusionary impulse. It revealed that the exclusionary impulse was subject to adjustment when it became economically inconvenient. The principle was not wrong. The price point had been set too high. In 1852, the tax was reintroduced at $4 per month, and this version was aimed more specifically at the Chinese. By 1852, over 20,000 Chinese miners had arrived in California, the largest non-American group in the goldfields. They were disciplined, organized, and effective workers. They took claims that white miners had abandoned as unproductive and extracted gold from them through patient, methodical reworking. This made them, in the eyes of the miners who had abandoned those claims, a provocation. Governor John Bigler sent a special message to the legislature on the 23rd of April, 1852, calling for restrictions on Chinese immigration. The new tax followed within weeks. The tax collectors who enforced the law against Chinese miners were paid on commission, typically up to 15% of what they collected. This gave them every incentive to be aggressive and no incentive to be accurate. Chinese miners who could not produce a current license receipt on demand had their equipment confiscated and their claims seized on the spot. Appeals were impossible. California law at this time prohibited Chinese people from testifying in court. A Chinese miner who was robbed under color of tax enforcement had no legal remedy. The law had built a system of extraction from people who had no standing to contest it. By the time the foreign miners' tax was finally struck down in 1870, Chinese miners had paid more than $5 million in taxes, a sum representing approximately a quarter of California's entire state revenue during that period. The state had been substantially funded by the labor of people it was simultaneously legislating into second-class status. The tax had not excluded the Chinese from the goldfields. It had taxed them for the privilege of being there, while ensuring they could never accumulate enough capital to secure their position. It was exploitation made legal, and it worked precisely as designed. The Californios, the Spanish and Mexican families who had held land in California before the American conquest, faced a different but equally systematic dispossession. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848 to end the Mexican-American War, had promised that existing Mexican land grants would be honored and that Californios would receive the full rights of American citizenship. The California Land Act of 1851 formally acknowledged those promises and immediately created the mechanism for circumventing them. The Land Act required every Californio landowner to file their claim with a newly created land commission and prove the validity of their Mexican grant within 2 years. The process required lawyers, surveyors, and court fees that most Californio families could not afford. The average claim took 17 years to resolve. During those 17 years, squatters occupied the land, taxes accumulated, and legal bills mounted. Many families won their cases in court and lost their land anyway, bankrupted by the cost of winning. The Peralta family, whose grant covered 49,000 acres in what is now the East Bay, retained fewer than 700 acres by the time the process concluded. Joaquin Murrieta was either a real man or a legend, and by 1853 California had decided it did not much matter which. What mattered was the story. He was said to be a Chilean or Mexican miner who had been driven from his legitimate claim by American squatters, had watched his family subjected to violence, and had turned outlaw in response. He became, across the Spanish-speaking communities of California, a symbol of what the laws had done and what resistance to those laws might look like. The California legislature offered a reward for his capture. In 1853, a company of rangers produced remains they claimed belonged to Murrieta, preserved and displayed for a fee at exhibitions across California. Whether or not it was his, the display served its purpose. It was a public statement about what happened to men who refused to accept the terms California was offering. The arc from the Foreign Miners Tax of 1850 to the Federal Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was not accidental. It was sequential. Each law built on the previous one's logic, extended its reach, and hardened its language. The California legislature had established, in the early 1850s, that the state had the right to define which immigrants could participate in economic life on its territory. The federal government formalized that principle 30 years later, banning Chinese immigration to the United States entirely. It was the first law in American history to prohibit immigration on the basis of race and national origin. Its legal and ideological foundations had been laid in the gold fields of the Sierra Nevada, in the years when the gold was running out and the government needed someone to blame. What this sequence of legislation accomplished, in the span of a single generation, was the systematic removal of the people who had built the most productive early phase of California's mining economy. The Chilean and Mexican miners who had arrived first with the deepest expertise. The Chinese workers who had reworked abandoned claims with extraordinary efficiency. The California landowners whose ranches and knowledge of the territory had provided the agricultural foundation without which the mining camps could not have been fed. All of them were, by legal mechanism or financial attrition, moved out of the economic structures they had helped to build. California kept what they built. It did not keep them. There was one additional law passed in 1855 and largely forgotten, which illuminates the period's logic with particular clarity. It was known informally as the Greaser Law. It stated that persons commonly known as greasers, a racial slur applied to people of Mexican and Latin American descent who were found to be vagrants and who were armed, could be prosecuted. Vagrant was left undefined. Armed was left undefined. The law gave local authorities the authority to arrest any Mexican or Latin American man in California on terms that were, in practice, whatever those authorities decided. It provided the legal scaffolding for the removal of a population that the foreign miners' tax had already economically marginalized. The word greaser appeared in the statute. The legislature had not found it necessary to edit it out. The exclusion zone that California built between 1850 and 1882 was not a sudden eruption of racial hostility. It was a legislative program, written in stages, revised when inconvenient, and extended when effective. It drew on the specific anxieties produced by the gold rush, competition for diminishing resources, resentment of successful outsiders, the need for a reason why most miners had failed, and transformed those anxieties into durable institutional structures. The laws outlasted the gold by decades. The structures they created outlasted the laws themselves. The California that emerged from the gold rush was not shaped by the men who dug it. It was shaped by the men who decided who was allowed to dig. Before the gold, California was one of the most linguistically and culturally diverse places on Earth. Approximately 150,000 indigenous people lived in the territory in 1848, organized into as many as 500 distinct self-governing tribal societies, speaking more than 100 different languages. They had lived there for thousands of years. Their economies were sophisticated, built around the abundant coastal and river ecosystems, the acorn harvest to the oak forests, and trade networks that connected communities across the length and breadth of the territory. This was the world that existed on January the 23rd, 1848, the day before James Marshall reached into the tail race. The first violence came from the miners themselves, without organization or instruction. As prospectors pushed into the Sierra Nevada foothills and the river valleys beyond, they encountered indigenous communities whose land they were entering without permission and whose resources, the same rivers and streams that supplied the gold, they were claiming as their own. When those communities resisted displacement, or when miners perceived a threat, the response was immediate and often collective. Entire camps of men would ride out together. There was no law to prohibit it. There was no authority that would act on a complaint from an indigenous person. California law, from the moment of statehood, explicitly prohibited Native Californians from testifying in court. The first governor of California, Peter Hardeman Burnett, addressed the state legislature in January of 1851. His words were recorded and preserved. He told the assembled lawmakers that a conflict between the races would continue until the Indian race became extinct, and that this outcome was to be expected. He said it matter-of-factly, as a statement of anticipated fact rather than a statement of regret. Burnett had signed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians into law 9 months earlier. The title of that act was its most complete deception. The Act for the Government and Protection of Indians was passed on April the 22nd, 1850, 2 days before California had been a state for a year. It was California's first legislature's most consequential piece of legislation regarding the indigenous population. It permitted any white Californian to have any Native American adult arrested on a charge of vagrancy, with vagrancy left undefined, and auctioned to the highest bidder as an indentured laborer for a term of up to 4 months. The term limitation was, in practice, never enforced. The arrested person had no legal standing to contest the charge. The act went further. It permitted white Californians to take custody of Native American children and hold them as indentured workers under terms that extended into adulthood, under the act's language as apprentices. Scholars have estimated that between 10,000 and 27,000 Native Californians were held in forced labor under its provisions, thousands of whom were minors. The state that had entered the Union as a free state, the state whose founding document explicitly prohibited slavery, had legalized a form of bondage for the people who had been there longest. The state militias were funded with public money. California's first legislature appropriated over $1.5 million, eventually totaling more than $1.7 million for military campaigns against indigenous communities. The money paid for weapons, horses, and provisions for men organized into companies whose stated purpose was the suppression of native resistance. What the militia expeditions actually constituted, as historian Benjamin Madley documented in meticulous detail in his 2016 study, was a systematic campaign of mass killing. The state was paying its citizens to destroy the people who had been there before them, and recording the expenditure in its official accounts. Local governments added their own inducements on top of the state's. Bounties were established in several counties, paid to men who brought in evidence that they had located and killed Native Californians. The amounts varied by county and by year. In Shasta, in 1855, local authorities paid $5 per confirmed killing of a Native Californian. In Honey Lake, in 1863, local authorities paid 25 cents per confirmed killing. One county in Northern California voted a specific tax on its residents to fund, in the resolution's own language, the total destruction of the indigenous population. The editors of Alaskan Sagebrush newspaper proposed in 1868 a $500 bounty per killing, describing the prospect as a new gold rush for the state. These were not the words of anonymous extremists. They were public documents. The destruction moved through indigenous communities along multiple channels simultaneously. Disease had been reducing California's native population since the Spanish Mission period, but the gold rush accelerated the exposure dramatically. 300,000 new arrivals in 7 years brought pathogens that communities with no prior exposure had no resistance to. Cholera, measles, smallpox, and typhoid moved through the river valleys where miners and indigenous people shared water sources. Entire communities were reduced to fractions of their former size by disease alone, before militia violence or forced labor was factored into the count. The mining operations themselves systematically destroyed the food systems on which indigenous communities depended. The rivers that supplied the salmon runs had provided reliable protein for thousands of years. Miners diverted them, dammed them, and filled them with the mercury and sediment runoff from hydraulic operations. The oak forests where communities had harvested acorns, the staple carbohydrate of much of California's indigenous diet, were cut for mine timbers and fuel. Hunting grounds were overrun by the cattle and livestock of incoming settlers. The food infrastructure that had sustained these communities for millennia was dismantled in the span of a decade, and no alternative was offered. The Act for the Government and Protection of Indians also targeted language. Children taken into indenture were placed in white households where their own languages were not spoken and not permitted. They were separated from the elders who carried the oral traditions, the stories, the ceremonial knowledge, and the practical ecological understanding accumulated over generations. When those children eventually returned, if they returned, they often could not speak to their grandparents. The linguistic destruction was not incidental to the act. It was one of its mechanisms. A community that cannot speak to its elders cannot transmit what its elders know. Within a generation, the knowledge was gone with the people who had held it. By 1870, California's indigenous population had fallen from roughly 150,000 to approximately 30,000. By 1900, it had fallen further to around 16,000. An estimated 100,000 people had died in the first 2 years of the gold rush alone. Historian Benjamin Madley's accounting of direct violent deaths, drawn from militia records, court documents, newspaper accounts, and survivor testimonies, identifies between 9,492 and 16,094 people killed in documented incidents between 1846 and 1873. The state and federal government spent more than $1.7 million funding those campaigns. The killing was not spontaneous. It was budgeted. The large massacres are documented but not widely known. In 1850, approximately 400 Pomo people were surrounded and killed by United States Army troops at a site on Clear Lake that survivors subsequently called Bloody Island. The Army's justification was retaliation for the deaths of 2 white settlers. The disproportion between the provocation and the response was not noted in official records as anything unusual. It was filed as a military operation. Similar operations were recorded across northern and central California throughout the 1850s and 60s. The pattern was consistent: an incident involving 1 or 2 white settlers, followed by a collective response against the nearest indigenous community, followed by an official report classifying the action as pacification. The federal government's role was not passive. The United States Army participated directly in multiple campaigns. Federal officials in Washington were aware of what was happening in California, the governor's statements, the bounty systems, the scale of population loss, and chose not to intervene. The federal government had, in 1851, negotiated 18 treaties with California's tribal nations, promising reserve lands in exchange for the tribe's cession of most of the territory. The United States Senate refused to ratify any of them. The treaties were filed in secret and remained classified for more than 50 years. The tribal nations had signed agreements that their government had never intended to honor. The land promised in those treaties was open to white settlement, while the documents that promised it sat in a locked archive in Washington. California issued a formal apology for what had been done to its indigenous peoples in 2019. Governor Gavin Newsom's executive order acknowledged, in the language of the order itself, California's dark history of state-sponsored violence and discrimination against Native peoples. That acknowledgement came 169 years after the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians was signed into law. The people who had built the food systems the miners destroyed, who had lived in the river valleys before the gold was found, who had been held in bondage under a law that described itself as protection. They had waited 169 years for the state to use the word that the historical record had long since established. The word is genocide. What makes this chapter of the gold rush particularly significant for the purposes of this documentary is not simply its moral weight, though that weight is considerable. It is what it reveals about the architecture of the event as a whole. The indigenous catastrophe was not a side effect of the gold rush. It was a precondition for it. The land the miners worked had been taken from people who were still living on it. The rivers they diverted fed communities that had depended on them for thousands of years. The labor extracted under the indenture laws helped build the infrastructure that sustained the mining economy. The catastrophe was not separate from the gold rush. It was underneath it, holding it up. Today, California has the largest Native American population of any state in the United States and is home to 109 federally recognized tribes. They are the descendants of the people who survived the period this chapter describes. Their presence, despite everything, is the most direct refutation of Governor Burnett's prediction that a conflict between races would continue until the Indian race became extinct. The race did not become extinct. But the fact that we are noting this as remarkable tells us something about what was attempted and how close it came to succeeding. The silence that surrounded this history for most of the century and a half that followed was not accidental. The textbooks that shaped what generations of Americans understood about the gold rush were written in the decades immediately after it ended by historians working in a state whose founders had participated in the events being described. Hubert Howe Bancroft, whose multi-volume history of California became the definitive account of the period, documented the violence extensively and then categorized it as the unfortunate but necessary price of civilizational progress. He named the perpetrators. He recorded the body counts. And then he explained them away. The next chapter will address how that explanation became the official story and why it was so useful for so long. The California genocide had no name in public discourse for most of the 20th century. The word genocide itself was not coined until 1944 by the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who developed it to describe what had happened to his own people in Europe. When the term was eventually applied to California, it was resisted by state officials, by historians invested in the existing narrative, and by institutions whose founding wealth could be traced in a direct line to the dispossession of the people the word described. California did not become the first state in the American Union to formally acknowledge a genocide within its borders until 2019. The history had been there the whole time. The acknowledgement had to wait for the mythology to weaken enough to allow it. Every major historical event produces two histories. The first is what happened. The second is what the people who survived it and the institutions they built decided to remember. In the decades after the California Gold Rush, these two histories moved steadily apart. The distance between them was not accidental. It was the product of specific choices made by specific people, writers, historians, painters, politicians, and publishers who understood that the story of the gold rush was also the story of California's legitimacy, and that legitimacy required a particular kind of telling. The mythology of the 49er was already forming before the gold ran out. By the early 1850s, newspapers across the United States were running accounts of the gold rush that emphasized individual heroism, democratic opportunity, and the romance of the frontier. The men in these accounts were almost always American, almost always white, and almost always the protagonists of their own stories. The Chilean miner with superior technique, the Chinese worker reworking an abandoned claim with methodical patience, the California rancher watching squatters occupy his land while courts deliberated, these were not the figures that appeared in the newspapers of Boston or Philadelphia. The reading public had been given a story, and the story had a cast. The dime novel industry of the 1850s and 60s crystallized that cast into archetype. These were cheap, mass-produced paperback books sold for 10 cents and consumed in enormous quantities by a reading public hungry for narratives of the American West. The 49er became one of their central figures, a man of grit and independence, unencumbered by the class structures of the East, free to remake himself in a new land by the force of his will and the luck of his pan. The figure was white, male, and singular. The world he inhabited was conveniently empty of the people who had actually filled it. The dime novel was not history, but it reached far more people than history did. The visual culture of the gold rush did the same work in images. The paintings and lithographs produced in the 1850s and 1860s depicted the gold fields as a landscape of individual endeavor, men with pans and shovels, rivers gleaming with possibility, a democratic scene of honest labor. These images circulated widely, reproduced in newspapers and magazines, hung in public buildings, and eventually anthologized into the visual vocabulary of American national identity. They showed men of Northern European appearance at their work. The faces of the Chinese workers, the Chilean miners, and the indigenous people whose land was being dismantled were not in the frame. Hubert Howe Bancroft was the most important single figure in the construction of the official gold rush narrative. He arrived in California in 1852 as a book dealer and spent the following decades assembling what became the largest private library of Western American history on the continent. By the 1880s, he had deployed a team of researchers and writers to produce a multi-volume history of California that would become the definitive account of the period for generations. The works of Hubert Howe Bancroft ran to 39 volumes. It documented the gold rush in exhaustive detail. It also made a series of interpretive choices that shaped what that documentation meant. Bancroft recorded the violence against indigenous Californians. He recorded the foreign miners' tax, the land dispossession of the Californios, and the economic exclusion of the Chinese. He was not ignorant of these facts. What he did with them was place them within a framework of inevitable progress, the idea that California's development required the displacement of those who had come before, and that this displacement, however regrettable in its particulars, was the necessary price of civilization. This framework did not invent the violence, but it provided the vocabulary for accepting it, and that vocabulary entered the standard account of the gold rush and remained there for most of the following century. The 49er as American archetype served a specific ideological function in the decades after the Civil War. The United States in the 1870s and 1880s was a country in the middle of a profound economic transformation, the rise of industrial capitalism, wage labor, corporate consolidation, and the erosion of the independent craftsman and farmer. The myth of the 49er offered a counter-image, the self-reliant individual who succeeded or failed on his own terms, in a world where the market had not yet closed around him. That myth was useful precisely because the reality it described had already disappeared. It was a consolation, not a description. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed in the same cultural moment that was producing the myth of the 49er. It is worth holding both things in view simultaneously. At the precise moment that popular culture was constructing an image of Gold Rush California as a place of democratic opportunity, the federal government was formalizing the exclusion of the largest non-American group that had participated in it. The mythology and the legislation were not in contradiction. They were complementary. One described who the beneficiaries of opportunity were. The other enforced it. The textbooks that carried the gold rush into the 20th century were built on Bancroft's framework and the popular culture that surrounded it. They emphasized the scale of the migration, the transformation of California, the speed of statehood, and the entrepreneurial spirit of the 49ers. They mentioned the foreign miners' tax in passing, if at all. They described the fate of California's indigenous people in the passive voice. The population declined, diseases spread, traditional ways of life were disrupted, language that distributed no responsibility and named no perpetrators. The active voice, the state funded militias, legislators voted bounties, governors called for extermination, was not the language these textbooks used. What the mythology accomplished across the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th was the construction of a founding story for California that its institutions could stand on. The University of California, opened in 1868, did not advertise that its founding was made possible in part by the labor of people excluded from its premises by the laws its founding generation had written. The Central Pacific Railroad, completed in 1869, did not note in its promotional materials that the Chinese workers who built the majority of its western section had been expelled from the state that railroad was meant to serve. Wells Fargo did not mention in its anniversary histories that its first customers were the men who had paid the foreign miners' tax. The institutions kept the gold. They edited out the hands that had dug it. The mythology of the California Gold Rush is not a relic. It persists in the way the period is taught, memorialized, and commercially represented. The San Francisco 49ers football team, named after the 49ers, plays in a stadium built on the peninsula those 49ers transformed. The state's official nickname, the Golden State, refers to the gold discovery that made California famous. The image of the independent prospector with his pan and his mule appears in tourist materials, museum exhibitions, and educational curricula across the state. These are not neutral cultural artifacts. They are the surviving infrastructure of a story that was built to serve specific purposes, and they continue to serve those purposes by remaining the most visible version of what happened. The California Gold Rush produced approximately $750 million worth of gold between 1848 and 1855, equivalent to roughly $24 billion in today's terms. That number is real and significant. But the gold itself was not the most durable thing the gold rush created. Gold is extracted and spent. What endures is the infrastructure built around its extraction, the institutions, the networks, the routes, and the cities that organized themselves to serve the rush and then outlasted it by generations. Understanding what the gold rush actually built requires separating the gold from everything it paid for. California became the 31st state of the United States in September of 1850, less than 2 years after James Marshall found a metal scale in the tail race at Coloma. No territory had ever moved so quickly from acquisition to statehood. The population surge the gold rush produced gave California the numbers it needed to qualify. The political urgency of settling the question of slavery in the new Western territories gave Congress the motivation to act. California entered the Union as a free state under the Compromise of 1850, tipping the congressional balance between free and slave states and deepening the national tensions that would eventually produce the Civil War. The gold discovery had set in motion a political sequence whose consequences extended far beyond California. California gold financed a significant portion of the Union's effort in the Civil War. The state produced more than half of all the gold mined in the United States between 1850 and 1900, and California gold paid for approximately 10% of the Union's war expenditure. The Confederacy had no equivalent resource. The geographic and financial consequences of this asymmetry were considerable. The Union's ability to sustain its war effort was partially dependent on a gold supply that had been unlocked by Carpenter's discovery in the Sierra Nevada streambed 13 years before the first shots were fired. The gold rush had, without anyone planning it, helped determine the outcome of a war fought on the other side of the continent. San Francisco was the gold rush's most visible creation. In 1848, it was a hamlet of fewer than 1,000 people at the edge of a bay that most Americans could not have located on a map. By 1850, it had 25,000 residents. By 1870, it had 150,000, and it was the largest city on the Pacific coast of North America. Its port had become the third busiest in the United States and the gateway to Pacific trade with China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the islands of the Pacific. The city had a stock exchange, multiple daily newspapers, theaters, grand hotels, a banking sector, and a professional class. It had been built, in its physical fabric, by labor that the mythology of the gold rush consistently forgot to credit. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed on the 10th of May 1869, when Leland Stanford drove the ceremonial Golden Spike at Promontory Summit, Utah, was the gold rush's most consequential infrastructure legacy. It connected California to the eastern United States by rail for the first time, reducing a journey of months to 1 day. It made California's agricultural produce accessible to eastern markets and brought eastern manufactured goods west in volume. It transformed the economic geography of the continent, and it was built on its western section predominantly by Chinese workers, 15,000 to 20,000 men from Guangdong province, many of whom had first come to California for the gold rush and stayed when it ended, finding work wherever work was available. The Central Pacific Railroad's directors, Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, the men history calls the Big Four, had built their initial capital in the gold rush economy. Stanford had sold supplies to miners from his Sacramento store. Crocker had run a dry goods business. Huntington had sold hardware. Hopkins had managed a store. Their railroad fortunes grew from merchant capital that had been accumulated in the rush years. When Stanford drove that golden spike in 1869, he did not mention the Chinese workers whose labor had made the ceremony possible. His remarks, recorded at the time, contained no such acknowledgement. The omission was consistent with the broader pattern of the period. Wells Fargo survived the financial panic of 1855 when most California banks failed, and emerged as the dominant banking and express service on the Pacific Coast. Its network of offices spread across every significant town in California and eventually across the continent. It created the first transcontinental express line, extending its reach to Japan, Australia, Hong Kong, South America, Mexico, and Europe. The institution that Henry Wells and William Fargo had built to transport gold from Sierra Nevada claims to San Francisco vaults became one of the foundational financial institutions of the American West. It still carries their names, and its origins remain in the gold rush economy that created the need for it. The University of California was founded in 1868, 20 years after the gold discovery, in a state whose entire institutional infrastructure had been built in the gold rush's wake. Its founding endowment drew on the prosperity generated by that period. Leland Stanford founded Stanford University in 1885, endowing it with the fortune he had built as a merchant, railroad magnate, and former governor of California. These institutions trained the engineers, lawyers, doctors, and administrators who governed and developed California through the 20th century. They were built on capital whose origins ran directly through the gold rush years and through the labor and dispossession that those years contained. The agricultural California that emerged in the decades after the gold rush, the Central Valley farms, the citrus groves, the wine country, the vegetable operations that would eventually feed much of the United States, was built on land and water infrastructure developed largely by Chinese labor after the gold ran out. Chinese workers dynamited roads through the Sierra Nevada, cleared fields in the Central Valley, built hundreds of miles of irrigation ditches, constructed stone fences, and reclaimed swampland for agriculture. The Professor Gene Pfalzer, writing about this period, documented the systematic ways in which Chinese labor built the physical infrastructure of agricultural California, while Chinese people were simultaneously being excluded from the political and economic structures that infrastructure supported. The ledger of what the gold rush actually built is therefore divided. On one side, a state, a transcontinental railroad, the largest Pacific port in North America, the banking networks that financed Western expansion, the agricultural infrastructure of California's Central Valley, and a gold supply that helped preserve the Union in its most dangerous hour. These are real and substantial achievements. On the other side, the labor and knowledge that produced these things came disproportionately from people who were excluded from their benefits, the Chinese workers who built the railroad and were then expelled from the state, the California landowners whose ranches were absorbed into the agricultural economy while their families were dispossessed, the indigenous communities whose rivers, food systems, and lands were the physical substrate on which everything else was constructed. The gold rush built California. It just did not build it for everyone who built it. In August of 1896, a man named George Carmack found gold on a tributary of the Klondike River in northwestern Canada. Within a year, 100,000 people were attempting to reach the Yukon Territory by any route available. They crossed mountain passes in winter with their provisions strapped to their backs. They built boats on the wrong side of frozen lakes and paddled them to Dawson City when the ice broke. They arrived to find that most of the productive claims had already been staked. Most went home having spent more than they found. The men who became wealthy in the Klondike were, as in California, predominantly the ones who had sold supplies, transport, and services to the people doing the digging. The pattern was identical. The mythology that formed around it was identical. Even the newspaper language was identical. In 1886, a prospector named George Harrison found gold on the Witwatersrand Plateau in what is now South Africa. The rush that followed was different in character from California's, The ore was deep underground from the beginning, which meant that industrial mining corporations arrived early and the independent prospector phase was brief. But the social consequences followed the same template with striking precision. A migrant labor force was assembled, this time predominantly black African men, drawn or coerced from across southern Africa, to perform the dangerous underground work. The men who owned the mines accumulated extraordinary wealth. The men who dug them were housed in enclosed compounds, paid minimal wages, and stripped of the ability to organize or bargain. The Witwatersrand Gold Rush built Johannesburg. It also built the legal and physical infrastructure of racial separation that would eventually be formalized in 1948 as apartheid. The Oklahoma Land Rush of 1889 was not a gold rush. It was land, not mineral wealth, that drew the crowds. But the template was the same. The territory that had been designated by the United States government as permanent Indian land, the Indian Territory promised to the 5 civilized tribes relocated from the American South, was declared available for settlement and open to white homesteaders in a single afternoon. 50,000 people raced for claims on the 22nd of April, 1889. The indigenous communities whose land it had formerly been had no standing to prevent it. The mythology that formed around the event celebrated the energy and initiative of the settlers. It did not dwell on the prior legal status of the land they had just claimed. The Texas oil boom of the early 20th century followed the California template so precisely that historians of the period have noted the resemblance in detail. The discovery at Spindletop in January of 1901 produced a gusher that flowed for 9 days and drew fortune seekers from across the country. The independent wildcatters, the prospectors of the oil era, worked the surface formations with hand tools and determination. The men who became wealthy were predominantly the ones who consolidated claims, controlled transportation and refining infrastructure, and captured the commercial ecosystem around the wells. The independent wildcatter became the mythological figure of the Texas oil industry. In the same way, the 49er had become the mythological figure of the California Gold Rush, a story about individual initiative that obscured where the money actually went. In Nigeria, the discovery of oil in the Niger Delta in 1956 produced a boom whose social consequences tracked the California template with uncomfortable precision. The communities whose land sat above the oil deposits, the Ogoni, the Ijaw, the Orobo, and others, did not own the oil. Nigerian law vested mineral rights in the federal government. The oil companies that extracted the resource paid royalties to the state. The communities that lived with the environmental consequences of extraction, the gas flares, the pipeline failures, the contamination of fishing grounds, received a fraction of the revenues and bore the full weight of the costs. The mythology of oil as Nigeria's national wealth obscured the same division that the California mythology had obscured, between those who owned the resource and those who lived on top of it. The Democratic Republic of Congo holds approximately 70% of the world's known cobalt reserves, a mineral essential to the lithium-ion batteries that power electric vehicles and renewable energy storage. The communities that live above those deposits are among the poorest on Earth. The companies that extract and refine the cobalt are headquartered in Europe, North America, and China. The workers who dig it in artisanal mines, including miners, in conditions of extreme physical danger, earn wages that bear no relationship to the value of what they extract. The technology companies whose products depend on Congolese cobalt are worth trillions of dollars. The pattern established in the Sierra Nevada foothills in 1848 has not been revised. It has been scaled. What connects these cases, California, the Klondike, the Witwatersrand, Oklahoma, Texas, the Niger Delta, the Congo, is not coincidence. It is a structural logic that recurs whenever a valuable resource is discovered in a place where the people already living there lack the legal, military, or economic power to control what happens to it. The resource attracts outside capital. The outside capital assembles labor. The labor, being expendable in the eyes of the capital, is drawn from the most economically vulnerable populations available. The profits flow outward. The costs remain. And when the resource runs thin, the labor is discarded, and mythology is written to celebrate the men who organized the extraction, not the ones who performed it. The The California Gold Rush was the first instance of this pattern operating at modern industrial scale in a documented and fully legible historical record within a democratic state governed by the rule of law. That is what makes it so useful to study. It was not conducted in secret. The laws that enable the exclusion and dispossession were passed in open legislative sessions and published in official records. The bounties paid for indigenous lives were line items in state budgets. The foreign miners' tax receipts were kept in county ledgers. Everything was written down. The pattern was not hidden. It was simply not the story that was told about what happened, because the people with the authority to tell the story were the people who had benefited from the pattern. There is a concept in economics and development studies called the resource curse, the observed tendency for countries and regions with abundant natural resources to experience less economic growth, less democracy, and more conflict than comparable places without them. The concept was formalized in the 1990s, based on data from oil-producing states. But its dynamics were fully visible in California in the 1850s. The gold rush produced extraordinary aggregate wealth. It distributed that wealth to the men who positioned themselves above the extraction, the merchants, the bankers, the railroad builders, the land speculators. The people who performed the extraction were taxed, expelled, or destroyed. The resource had not blessed them. It had made them useful and then made them inconvenient. The California Gold Rush ended, by most accounts, around 1855. The surface gold was gone. The independent miner was being replaced by industrial operations. The population had stabilized. The laws of exclusion had done their work. But the template the gold rush had established did not end. It replicated. Every subsequent resource boom in the modern era has followed some version of the same architecture: migration, the extraction, the exclusion, and the mythology manufactured afterward to explain why things turned out the way they did. What the California Gold Rush offers, 178 years after James Marshall reached into that stream bed, is the opportunity to read the original document, to see in the clearest possible detail how the template was first assembled, who assembled it, and what it was designed to produce. The story did not begin in California, but California is where it was written down clearly enough to read.